The bill from St. Jude's was past due, not by a lot, not yet, but it was looming, and the late fees were already threatening to turn it into something unmanageable. $1,847.23. That's what it would take to keep the collection calls from starting, to keep Sarah's credit from taking another hit, to keep the whole thing from spiraling. I'd emptied the emergency fund, sold my decent camera gear, and was now here. The Midnight Diner. It wasn't even a good name. It sounded like a bad 1980s movie. But Felix, the guy who owned it, didn't ask questions. Didn't even seem to look at me, really. Just handed over the keys and a manila envelope, said "Starts now," and went home. The diner smelled like old grease and something faintly floral, like someone had tried to cover up the grease with air freshener but given up halfway through. The booths were ripped in places, patched with mismatched vinyl, and the floor was that speckled linoleum that always looked dirty no matter how hard you scrubbed. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sickly yellow buzz that made everything look washed out. There were 6 booths, a counter with maybe 10 stools, and a small kitchen visible through a pass-through window. A chipped Formica tabletop held a dusty plastic plant. The coffee machine gurgled even though it wasn't on. It was tired, just like me. I set my backpack behind the counter, the weight of my laptop and a few granola bars feeling heavier than it should. I needed this to work. I needed to be able to call Lily this weekend and tell her I'd found a way to send her that art kit she wanted, the one with the good watercolors I'd promised. Then I noticed the envelope. Plain manila. My name, Kieran O'Connell, typed on the front. No return address. I hadn't asked about it. Felix hadn't mentioned it. I almost didn't open it, figured it was some kind of inventory list or a work schedule, but it felt intentional, like it was waiting for me. Inside were several sheets of paper, also typed, with a list. The first line read, "Important. If any clock on the premises stops at 3:17 a.m., do not restart it. Cover it and report." 3:17 a.m.? That was specific. I glanced around. There were 3 clocks, one over the grill, one by the cash register, and a small round one in the back near the restrooms. I chuckled under my breath. Some previous employee was clearly a bit of a character. Probably a superstitious cook. I could see it. The next rule. When stationary, always position yourself so your back is against a wall or solid surface. Never stand with your back exposed to open space. Okay, now that was just weird. Paranoid, even. Like someone had worked here during the apocalypse. I pictured a grizzled old short-order cook, constantly scanning for bandits. Never count aloud on the premises. All counting, inventory, rooms, people must be done silently. Written tallies are acceptable. That was oddly controlling. I imagined Felix, a stern, silent type, enforcing this rule with a glare. Probably just wanted to keep things quiet for the truckers who pulled over to sleep. If you receive static discharge in the same area more than twice in one shift, leave that area and do not return during that shift. Seriously, static electricity? I rubbed my hand against the vinyl of a booth. It was dry, a little sticky, probably just a buildup of dust. At shift start, check all floor drains in the kitchen. If any drain is covered with anything that was not placed there by maintenance, uncover it using the provided tool, not your hands, and report. I made a mental note to find this provided tool. That one felt less silly, more like a health code thing. Do not look up in the storage loft unless there is a specific work reason to do so. If you do look up, complete the task and look away. The storage loft. I hadn't even noticed it yet. Above the kitchen, a small square opening in the ceiling, probably just boxes of supplies. Still, it felt oddly worded. Do not bring any items that are yellow onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. I checked my backpack. My water bottle was blue. My granola bars were in a brown wrapper. I was good. This was getting ridiculous. This place was a time capsule of strange rules. A prank, maybe, some kind of initiation for new hires? It was probably meant to be funny. If your footsteps echo in an area where they normally don't, stop walking and stand still for 30 seconds before continuing. I shifted my weight, testing the floorboards. No echo yet. Every visitor receives a badge at entry. At the end of each shift, Count the returned badges. The number returned must equal the number issued. If it does not, do not leave. That one felt wrong. It wasn't funny. It felt like a threat, but a vague, nonsensical one. I shook my head. I was tired. Probably just getting paranoid myself. I tossed the rules onto a shelf behind the counter, next to a stack of paper placemats. They didn't matter. I had a job to do. I started wiping down the counter, the smell of the cleaning spray doing little to mask the underlying grease. The coffee machine gurgled again. As I finished wiping, I glanced at the clock above the grill. It read 12:05 a.m. Still ticking. Everything seemed normal, except for the way the fluorescent lights flickered just at the edge of my vision and the way the silence felt heavy. I pulled up a stool, adjusted the radio to a static-filled country station, and waited for the first truck to pull in. And I tried not to think about the $1,847.23. I was restocking the sugar caddies, small white porcelain containers, each holding around 12 individual packets of white sugar and a couple of the pink stuff for people who liked it sweet. Old Man Hemlock, the previous owner before Felix, apparently hated sugar. He said it attracted ants, and ants attracted, well, he never said what ants attracted, just that it was bad. Felix said Hemlock was eccentric, a hoarder, and probably just didn't like cavities. The diner wasn't busy. A single trucker, Weston, was nursing a coffee at the counter, reading a paperback with a lurid cover. He hadn't said much since he came in, just nodded a greeting when I took his order. The radio was still crackling with static, occasionally spitting out a snatch of a country song. Mostly static, though. I tried fiddling with the dial, but it didn't seem to make much difference. I moved along the counter, filling the caddies, wiping down any spills. The laminate was worn in places, faded from years of sunlight and cleaning. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and something else, something metallic. Not like blood? Not exactly. More like old plumbing. I made a note to check the sinks again later. I reached the end of the counter, near the entrance, and my gaze fell on the wall clock. It was one of those old-fashioned ones, with a large white face and black numbers. I hadn't really noticed it before. Now I did. It wasn't ticking, and the hands were frozen. I stared at it for a moment, frowning. It had been ticking when I started my shift. I was sure of it. Probably just a battery. A cheap clock like that. The batteries probably died all the time. I reached for it, my fingers already moving to open the back and replace the battery. Then, something flickered at the edge of my memory. A phrase. A warning. Something about clocks. If any clock on the premises stops at a specific time, do not restart it. That was it. Vague, like most of them. I couldn't remember the specific time, just that it was important not to restart it. Ridiculous. It was just a clock. A broken clock. Felix was just being paranoid. Probably thought someone was messing with the staff, trying to scare them. I paused, my hand hovering inches from the clock's face. The metallic smell seemed stronger here. I pulled my hand back. It was probably nothing still, that rule stuck in my head. It wasn't a logical fear. It wasn't like worrying about a health code violation or a disgruntled customer. It was a primal unease, a feeling that something wrong would happen if I touched that clock. I grabbed one of the spare paper tablecloths from the dispenser. It was a little crumpled, but it would do. Carefully, I draped it over the clock, obscuring the face. The hands remained frozen, pointing to, I couldn't quite tell. It was hard to see through the paper. Something around 3:17, maybe. It didn't matter. The important thing was that it was covered. I made a mental note to tell Felix about it in the morning. He could deal with it. He'd probably have a spare clock in the back, or know someone who could fix it. I didn't need another thing to worry about. The medical bills were bad enough, and I still hadn't called Lily. I'd promised her a drawing, a silly picture of a dinosaur wearing a party hat. I should do that during my break. I finished restocking the sugar caddies and walked back to the kitchen. The paper tablecloth still crumpled in my hand. Weston hadn't moved. He was still absorbed in his book. The radio continued to spit and crackle. The diner was quiet, too quiet. And now, there was a covered clock on the wall, silently marking a time I didn't know, a time I wasn't supposed to know. I wondered what would have happened if I'd just replaced the battery. I wondered what time it was stopping and what it had stopped from. I shoved the thought away and started wiping down the grill. The smell of grease and metal seemed amplified now, a strange, unsettling combination. I had a feeling I'd be thinking about that clock all night, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me more than the draft from the back door that I wouldn't look at it again. I was wiping down the booth seats, starting with the ones closest to the kitchen. Vinyl was cold under my hand, even through the damp cloth. The diner hadn't been busy, not even for a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. Just a few long-haul drivers, mostly keeping to themselves, nursing lukewarm coffee and staring out the window. The radio was still crackling, spitting out static and fragments of country songs. It was a low, constant hum that I'd almost tuned out. I'd gotten through all the booths on one side of the diner and was starting on the other. I moved methodically, lifting the seat cushions, wiping down the vinyl, then replacing the cushions. It was mindless work, but it gave me something to focus on, something to keep my mind from drifting to Lily and the bills and everything else. It was a relief when Weston asked for another coffee, a brief, human interaction. He didn't look up from his book, just held out his mug. I filled it, careful not to spill. He mumbled a thanks, his eyes still glued to the page. He'd been there for hours. Always the same book, always the same booth. I wondered what he was reading. Probably some dense historical work. He had that look about him. I finished with the booths and decided to tackle the small hallway leading to the restrooms. It was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. Felix had mentioned needing to replace the floor tiles in there, but hadn't gotten around to it yet. They were cracked and stained and smelled faintly of bleach and something else, something older. I grabbed the bucket with the cleaning solution and started scrubbing at the tiles. It was slow work, and my back was starting to ache. I moved further down the hallway, towards the restrooms. That's when I realized something. I hadn't been paying attention to where I was positioned. I was right in the middle of the hallway, facing the restrooms, and there was nothing behind me. Just open space. The hallway opened into the diner itself, a clear line of sight from the counter. My back was completely exposed. A flicker of something unsettling ran through me, a faint echo of Felix's voice, or maybe just my own imagination. There had been something in that list, something about positioning, not standing with your back to open space. It was hazy, fragmented. I couldn't quite grasp the exact wording, but the impression was clear enough. Don't leave yourself exposed. Ridiculous. It was a hallway. People walked through hallways all the time. I was being silly. Felix was just a worrier, and I was letting his paranoia get to me. It probably had something to do with security, making sure you could see who was coming and going. Just common sense. I was overthinking it. I bent down to scrub harder at a particularly stubborn stain on the tile, trying to dismiss the feeling. But then, a draft coiled around the back of my neck. Not a cold draft, exactly, more like a displacement of air, a subtle shift in pressure. And a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible click, like something settling into place. I straightened up abruptly, my hand still clutching the scrub brush. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping across the diner. Weston hadn't moved. He was still reading. The drivers were still staring out the window. Everything was the same, but the feeling of being watched, of being assessed, was overwhelming. Without thinking, I shuffled sideways, bracing my shoulder against the wall. The rough texture of the painted brick pressed against my skin, a small, almost involuntary movement, but enough. My back was no longer exposed. I stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, trying to calm my racing pulse. The click hadn't been anything, just the building settling. The draft was probably from the back door. It was probably nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something unseen. I finished cleaning the hallway, keeping my back pressed firmly against the wall. The hallway seemed smaller now, more confined. I didn't look back. I just wanted to get back to the diner, back to the relative safety of the booths and the counter. As I walked, I noticed a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the tile, right where my heels had been standing, facing toward the open space. It hadn't been there before. I made a mental note to ask Felix about it later, even though I knew he'd probably just shrug it off. I didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to get through the night. And I knew, with a growing certainty that I would be acutely aware of what was behind me for the rest of my shift, and maybe for a long time after that. The chipped formica of booth 6 was worse than I remembered, sticky even after I'd wiped it down twice. It felt like someone had spilled a whole bottle of something sweet and let it sit for a week. I was restocking the sugar caddies, trying to get ahead of the rush that never came, from midnight to 6, and usually around 3, the long haulers would start trickling in, needing a refill and a moment to stretch their legs. So far, nothing, just Weston, still hunched over his paperback, and the 2 drivers in the booth by the window, staring out at the blacktop. I filled each caddy until the little plastic packets overflowed. White sugar, brown sugar, the artificial sweetener stuff nobody ever asked for. It was a mindless task, good for keeping my hands busy and my mind somewhere else. I was supposed to call Kira tonight. She'd left a message earlier, a little breathless, talking about a science project and needing help with the volcano. I'd promised to call after 10, after things slowed down. It was almost 10 now, but slowing down felt like a distant fantasy. The medical bills were still looming, a dark cloud over everything. Every shift felt like a desperate attempt to outrun them. Booth 7 needed attention too, more crumbs, a ring of condensation from a forgotten coffee cup. I grabbed the spray bottle and a clean rag, moving methodically, trying to create some semblance of order in this perpetually messy space. I started clearing the table, stacking the menus, and then I noticed it. The napkin dispenser was almost empty. I always made it a point to keep those full. It was one of those small things that made the diner feel welcoming, I guess, or at least less desolate. I went to the supply closet, tucked away behind the kitchen. It was cramped and smelled faintly of bleach and stale cardboard. I grabbed a new box of napkins, a stack of stir sticks, and a replacement for the salt shaker in booth 1, which had been conspicuously devoid of salt for the past 2 nights. As I turned to leave, I realized I hadn't counted how many napkin packs were left. It was just a small thing, a habit from the grocery store I used to work at, but I always did a quick inventory before restocking. "Just to know what we've got?" I mumbled to myself, starting to add up the boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait, that didn't feel right. I started over. 1, 2, 3. I lost track, trying to picture the stacks in my head. 1, 2, 5. No, 6. Definitely 6. Except it felt like there should be more. I began counting again, slower this time, deliberately focusing on each box. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. There had been at least 8, maybe 9, but now there were only 6. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, a disconcerting echo of Felix's list. Something about counting, not aloud, something about not assigning numbers to things. My head throbbed. It was just napkins. I was tired. I'd gotten the count wrong the first time, the second time, maybe both times. It was a small, cramped space. My eyes were probably playing tricks on me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. A cold, creeping certainty that the number had shifted, changed while I was counting. I glanced around the closet, half expecting to see someone standing there, manipulating the boxes. Nothing. Just the dusty shelves and the faint smell of bleach. I grabbed the 6 packs of napkins and hurried back to the diner, avoiding the hallway. I restocked booth 7, deliberately avoiding another inventory. I didn't need to know how many stir sticks were left. I didn't need to know how many salt packets were on hand. I just needed to get through the shift. When I finally checked the time, it was 10:47. Too late to call Kira. She'd be asleep. I made a note to call first thing in the morning, but a knot of guilt tightened in my chest. Another promise broken, another small failure adding to the weight. I glanced towards Weston, still absorbed in his book, and the 2 drivers, still staring out into the night. I needed a coffee. And I knew, with a sickening clarity, that the number of those drivers hadn't been the same when I'd last looked. I didn't dare count them. I needed to update the employee schedule. Hal had called in sick, said it was the flu, but Hal always claimed the flu whenever he'd had a bad night at the poker table. It didn't matter, really. I just needed to rewrite the board, slot Bia in for his shifts. The schedule was kept in a battered metal filing cabinet in the small office off the kitchen. It wasn't much of an office, more of a glorified storage closet, but it was quiet, and for a few minutes I could escape the fluorescent hum of the diner and the low rumble of trucks passing on the highway. The cabinet was old, the kind with a locking bar that never quite caught. I had to jiggle it just right. I unlocked it, pulled open the bottom drawer, and reached for the laminated schedule. That's when it happened. A sharp, stinging shock ran up my arm, not enough to knock me back, but enough to make me gasp and yank my hand away. Static electricity. It always happened this time of year with the dry air. I rubbed my arm, feeling a dull ache. It was probably just the carpet. The diner's carpet was ancient, a faded maroon that generated static with every step. I touched the cabinet again, cautiously, and felt another jolt, a smaller one this time, but definitely there. Annoying, but nothing to worry about. I finished retrieving the schedule, ignoring the lingering tingle in my fingers. I took the schedule to the break room table, grabbed a dry erase marker, and started crossing out Hal's name. Bia would cover his Friday and Saturday shifts. Ilsa could pick up Sunday. It was a simple reshuffling of names, a logistical puzzle I'd solved countless times. As I was writing, the thought of the static nagged at me. It was unusual to get shocked twice in a row, but I figured the cabinet was just particularly bad. Old wiring or something. I finished updating the schedule and went back to the office to hang the new version. As I reached for the pushpins, I felt it again. Another shock, stronger than the first two. I recoiled, knocking over a stack of old order forms. They fluttered to the floor, a cascade of faded paper. I stared at the filing cabinet, my arm prickling. It wasn't the carpet. It wasn't the dry air. It was the cabinet. The thought of Felix's list flickered in my mind, a fragmented recollection, something about avoiding repetition, about not letting things happen more than once in the same place. Then the image of the napkin packs, the shifting number rose to the surface. It wasn't a clear rule, not in the way the printed instructions were, but a feeling, a sense of wrongness that resonated deep in my gut. Repeated things attracted attention. I told myself it was ridiculous. Static electricity was a normal phenomenon. The cabinet was old. I was tired. I had a wife who needed expensive medication, a daughter I barely saw. I was letting my imagination run wild. I reached out, intending to dismiss it all, to touch the cabinet one more time and prove it was nothing. But I stopped. My hand hovered in the air, inches from the cool metal. I remembered the tingling sensation, the almost painful jolt, and then a detail I hadn't noticed before. The tiny hairs on my arms were standing on end. Even though I hadn't touched anything, they weren't lying flat against my skin, but erect, like miniature bristles. I hadn't felt that before. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the cabinet. I didn't want to turn my back on it, not even for a second. The hallway was right behind me, and the sudden recollection of that feeling, that pressure from the other night, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I didn't want open space behind me. I turned and walked out of the office, carefully avoiding looking back. The break room was brighter, louder, filled with the clatter of dishes and the drone of the radio, safer. I leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths, trying to calm my racing pulse. I hadn't returned to the cabinet, hadn't even glanced in its direction. I finished my shift without going near the office. Weston asked if I needed help with something, noticing my unusual absence. I mumbled something about misplaced invoices and waved him off. When it was time to leave, I didn't bother to lock up the office. I just grabbed my coat and walked out, avoiding the hallway altogether. As I stepped into the cold night air, I glanced back at the diner. The office window was dark, a black rectangle in the brightly lit building. I could almost feel something watching me from inside. I drove home slowly, my mind replaying the events of the night. I hadn't imagined the shocks, I hadn't imagined the hairs on my arms, and I hadn't imagined the feeling, the unsettling certainty that something was wrong. Very wrong. I knew I wouldn't go back into that office, not during this shift, and maybe not ever. But a new worry settled in, cold and heavy. The schedule needed to be filed. And the filing cabinet wasn't going anywhere. I was wiping down the booths, the vinyl cold and slick under the sponge. It was a slow night, even for an overnight shift. Just a couple of truckers nursing coffee, a woman in a floral dress asleep in a corner booth, and the low hum of the refrigerators. I liked the slow nights. Less mess, less pressure, more time to just be. I needed that, every little bit of it. The booths were mostly clean, Just the usual spilled sugar and greasy fingerprints. I worked my way down the row, methodically scrubbing each surface, lost in the repetitive motion. Bia had left a stack of those little promotional flyers on the last table, advertising a local car dealership. I gathered them up, intending to toss them, but then I remembered the new checklist. Felix had taped it to the inside of the kitchen door, a laminated sheet with a list of things to check at the beginning of each shift. It was a new thing, he said, just to be thorough. It felt like more than that. Like a set of instructions. I hadn't bothered reading it closely, just skimmed it, looking for anything that involved actual cooking, which thankfully it didn't. I remembered a line now, something about drains, floor drains, checking them. I folded the flyers and set them aside, then walked towards the kitchen, the worn linoleum cool under my shoes. The checklist was still there, taped next to the time clock. I glanced at it, scanning the list. Shift start, floor drain inspection. Below that, a more detailed explanation. Check all drains in the dining area. Report any obstructions. Use provided hook. Do not use hands. Do not use hands. That part stuck out. It felt specific. Overly cautious. I told myself it was just a liability thing. Someone probably dropped something down a drain once and tried to fish it out, and now this was standard procedure. I was overthinking it. I always overthought things. I found the hook hanging next to the mop bucket, a simple piece of bent metal with a plastic handle. There were 3 floor drains in the dining area, tucked away in corners. The first 2 were clear, just a little bit of standing water, a faint smell of disinfectant. I poked around with the hook, just to be sure, then moved on to the third, located behind the last booth, near the restrooms. This one was different. Something was covering the drain. Not completely, but a flat, circular object pressed down over the metal grate. It was dark, almost black, and looked like rubber? Or maybe some kind of heavy plastic. It wasn't something you'd expect to find there. It didn't look like a dropped napkin or a forgotten coaster. It looked placed. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out what it was. Maybe it was a maintenance thing. Maybe someone had been working on the plumbing and hadn't taken it with them. But then I remembered the note, "Do not use hands." A flicker of unease ran through me. The hairs on my arms didn't stand on end like with the cabinet, but I felt a tightening in my chest, a subtle pressure. I hesitated for only a second. It was probably nothing, a piece of discarded material. But the instruction was clear, and the thought of ignoring it, of potentially missing something important, felt wrong. I reached for the hook, my hand surprisingly steady. I carefully slid the hook under the edge of the object and gently pried upwards. It resisted at first, then popped free with a soft suction sound. It wasn't rubber, it wasn't plastic, it was smooth, cold, and surprisingly heavy for its size. As I lifted it, I felt a distinct pressure against the underside of the drain, a subtle pulling sensation. Something had been holding it in place from below. I held the object up, examining it in the dim light. It was a solid disc, about 8 inches in diameter, a dark, mottled gray color. It didn't have any markings, no visible seams or edges. It just was, and it was undeniably heavy. Heavier than it should have been. I set it down on the floor, carefully, avoiding touching it with my bare hands. Looking down into the drain, I didn't see anything unusual, just the dark, damp metal of the grate, but the feeling of something holding the disc from below lingered, a strange, unsettling awareness. I glanced around the diner, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the truckers were still lost in their coffee, the woman in the floral dress was still asleep, and the kitchen was empty. I grabbed the checklist and marked off floor drain inspection. I didn't write anything in the report section. What could I write? Found a weird disc covering a drain, and it felt like something was holding it from underneath. That wouldn't go over well with Felix, or anyone. I just wanted to be done with it. I left the disc on the floor near the drain. I didn't want to touch it again. I walked back to the kitchen, my boots echoing on the linoleum. The air felt colder now, heavier, and as I passed the office I noticed the clock. It was still stopped, the hands frozen at 3:17. I didn't even glance at it, I just kept walking. I had a feeling it wasn't going to be a quiet night after all. I needed another coffee. And I needed to remember exactly what that disc had felt like, beneath the hook. It wasn't like anything I'd ever touched before. The coffee tasted burnt, even for this place. I added a ridiculous amount of sugar, stirred it until my wrist ached, and leaned against the counter, just watching the truckers. It was quiet, for a change. Most of them were nursing their mugs, staring out the window at the highway. Bia was wiping down the booths, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was the kind of quiet you only get after the initial rush, before the sun starts to come up and the next wave rolls in. I needed a night like this. I'd been thinking about the disc all morning, or what passed for morning at 3 a.m. The weight of it, the texture, it wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered. Metal, plastic, rubber, none of it felt right. It wasn't even cold in the way metal is cold or plastic. It was distant, like it hadn't absorbed any heat from anything around it. It was a strange sensation, and I found myself unconsciously rubbing my fingertips, trying to remember the exact feel of it. Maybe it was some kind of industrial component, something from a machine, old, discarded. Felix hadn't said anything about a drain inspection. He hadn't mentioned anything about needing to check the drains at all. It was just on the checklist. Another one of those little things that felt off, like they were testing me. Or maybe I was just tired running on fumes and bad coffee. The medical bills were weighing on me. That was the truth of it. Every hour here felt like a small victory against the mounting debt. Every dropped plate, every spilled coffee felt like a setback. I finished my coffee and started on the silverware, polishing forks and knives. The diner was old and the silverware was cheap, so it tarnished easily. It was a mindless task, something to occupy my hands. I was almost done when I heard it, a scraping sound above me. I froze, hand hovering over a stack of spoons. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scrape, like something heavy being dragged across a surface. It was coming from the storage loft, above the kitchen. We kept extra supplies up there, boxes of napkins, cleaning chemicals, spare light bulbs. I hadn't been up there in weeks. My pulse quickened, not with fear exactly, but with awareness, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It was probably just Weston reorganizing things. He was always puttering around, trying to make sense of the chaos. But even as I thought that, a memory surfaced. That note, the one with the rules. It wasn't about the clock, or the napkins, or the static. It was about looking. It was something about not looking up. A vague, unsettling instruction. Do not look up. I couldn't remember the specifics. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the gist of it was there, buried somewhere in the back of my mind. A warning, and the sound was directly above me. I told myself it was ridiculous. Just Weston, or maybe a rat. The place wasn't exactly spotless, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The tightening in my chest, the urge to glance upwards to see what was making the noise. I grabbed a clean cloth and started wiping down the already clean counter, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. The scraping stopped. Then, after a brief pause, a different sound began. A series of small thumps, like something falling, or being dropped. I kept wiping, my movements becoming jerky and mechanical. It wasn't Weston. Weston didn't drop things. I wanted to look. The curiosity was almost overwhelming. I had to know what was up there, but that fragmented memory, that hazy recollection of the note, held me back. The feeling of dread, of something fundamentally wrong, was too strong to ignore. I remembered the static, the unnatural coldness of the disc. I remembered the way the clock had felt when I'd avoided restarting it. I finished wiping the counter, then started on the coffee machine, scrubbing the spouts and the warming plate. I didn't look up once. I didn't even allow my gaze to drift towards the ceiling. I just kept cleaning, focusing on the mundane, the repetitive. I worked quickly, efficiently, determined to finish the task before I allowed myself to think about what might be happening above me. The thumping stopped. A silence descended, heavier than before. I finished cleaning the coffee machine, rinsed the cloth, and hung it to dry. Finally, I allowed myself to breathe. It was over. Whatever it was over. But as I straightened up, I noticed something. A small metallic object lying on the floor, near the base of the ladder leading to the loft. It was a screw, a large rusted screw, and it definitely hadn't been there before. I hadn't seen it when I was wiping the counter. It had appeared while I was focused on avoiding looking up. I left the screw where it was. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know where it came from. I just walked back to the kitchen, my boots feeling heavier than ever. The coffee tasted worse now, and the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It felt like something was listening. I was restocking the sugar caddies. It was a pointless task, really. Most people took their coffee black, or with those little powdered creamers. But BA, the daytime waitress, was meticulous. Everything had to be full, everything had to be neat. She'd leave a note if anything was off, and I didn't need any extra grief. The diner was quiet. 2 trucks were parked out front, their drivers probably asleep. The highway was mostly silent, just the occasional whoosh of a passing 18-wheeler. I liked this part of the shift before the early morning rush, the quiet, the predictability, just filling sugar, wiping tables, making sure the coffee was fresh. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a paycheck. And right now, a paycheck was everything. I had a system. Table 12, then 10, then the counter. I'd slide the caddies across the laminate, making sure they were lined up perfectly. It was stupid. I knew, but it gave me something to focus on, something to control. Control was in short supply these days. Between the bills and Kira's school play next month, it felt like everything was slipping through my fingers. I reached for my coffee, taking a long sip. It was lukewarm, but it was still better than nothing. I'd made a fresh pot about an hour ago, but it always seemed to cool down so quickly. I glanced at the clock above the grill. 2:47 a.m., still a long night ahead. I was about to move on to table 10 when I noticed it. The mug. It was bright, a cheerful, almost aggressively sunny yellow. I hadn't even registered it before. I always grabbed whatever was clean. I usually used a chipped blue one or a plain white one, but this one, it just stood out. It wasn't a big deal. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was just a color. A harmless color. I was being ridiculous, letting the weirdness of the last few days get to me. The clock, the napkins, the static, the drain, it was all just coincidence, bad luck, stress. I needed sleep. I needed to stop looking for patterns where there weren't any. It was a mug. But as I held it, a flicker of something, a half-formed memory surfaced. Something about not bringing certain things inside, something about a color, a restriction. It wasn't clear, but the feeling was there, a prickling at the back of my neck. The memory felt tied to that note, the one about the clock. I couldn't quite grasp it, but it was definitely there, nagging at me. I started to set the mug down, to grab a different one. But then Weston walked out of the back room, yawning and scratching his stomach. He glanced at me, then back at the grill. "Everything all right, Kieran?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Yeah, just restocking," I mumbled, instinctively tightening my grip on the mug. I didn't want to seem strange or paranoid. Weston already thought I was a bit odd, quiet and withdrawn. I didn't need him thinking I was losing it. He nodded and headed towards the coffee machine. "Good. Make sure you check the grease trap before the rush. Bia will have my hide if it's full." He turned his back, and I almost put the mug down then. But the thought of explaining it, of having to articulate this vague unease, stopped me. It sounded so stupid, a yellow mug. I took another sip of coffee, trying to appear normal. As I did, I saw Ilse walk in through the front door. She was one of the regulars, a long-haul trucker with a permanent scowl and a surprisingly gentle voice. She always ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me. Not at me, exactly. At the mug, her eyes fixed on it and her face. It wasn't a scowl anymore. It was something else, a kind of pinched, wary recognition. She didn't say anything, just stared, her jaw working slightly. That was enough. My hand started to sweat, making the mug slippery. The feeling of dread, which had been a dull ache, suddenly sharpened into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't just a color. It was the color, the one I wasn't supposed to bring in, the one that signaled something. Without thinking, I quickly slid the mug into my messenger bag, burying it under the stack of mail I'd brought with me, bills mostly. I didn't want Ilse to see, didn't want Weston to see, didn't want anyone to see. Ilse blinked, and the expression on her face shifted back towards her usual gruffness. She walked over to the counter and sat down. Coffee, black, she said, her voice raspy. I started to pour her a cup, my hand shaking slightly. I avoided looking at my bag, at the offending yellow mug hidden inside. I focused on the coffee, on the simple act of filling the cup. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made things worse, that by acknowledging the rule, by almost breaking it, I'd somehow activated something. As I handed Ilse her coffee, I noticed something else. The air in the diner felt colder than before. Not just a slight chill, but a deep, penetrating cold that settled into my bones. And the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was watching like before, but closer, more focused. I glanced at Weston, who was still fiddling with the coffee machine. He hadn't noticed anything. He was just tired, going through the motions. I wanted to ask him if he felt it, if he noticed the change in the air, but I couldn't. I didn't want to sound crazy. Ilse took a sip of her coffee and let out a small sigh. "Thanks," she said, without looking at me. She pulled out a map and started tracing a route with her finger. The diner felt smaller now, claustrophobic. I finished wiping down the counter, then started rearranging the salt and pepper shakers. Anything to keep my hands busy, anything to avoid looking at my bag. I kept thinking about the mug, about the feeling of dread, about Ilse's reaction, and about the scraping sound from the loft. It was quiet now, but I knew it would be back. And next time, I wasn't so sure I could avoid looking up. My bag felt heavy on my shoulder, a silent yellow weight. I was restocking the sugar caddies. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was something to do, and it got me moving. The diner was mostly empty at 3:17 a.m. Just Bia in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of tea and reading a paperback with a lurid cover. Weston was slumped over the grill, half asleep, occasionally flipping a piece of bacon. Ilse was nowhere to be seen, which was good. Less scrutiny, less of that tight-lipped disapproval. The sugar packets were in a cardboard box in the back, near the walk-in freezer. I'd been doing this for almost a month now, and the floor back there was just concrete, always a little slick with condensation from the freezer. It never echoed. Never. It was a small space, crowded with boxes, and sound just died. I was pulling out a stack of the pink packets when I took a step, and the sound of my boot hitting the floor came back at me. A distinct hollow echo. I stopped. Just for a second. Thought it was my imagination. Maybe a truck had passed, causing a vibration. Maybe Bia had shifted in her booth and I'd misheard. I took another step. Again, the echo. Clear as a bell, like I was walking in a tiled hallway, not a cramped storage area. It wasn't loud, but it was there. Something had changed. It reminded me of that list. The one I found taped to the underside of the office desk. I couldn't remember exactly what it said, not word for word. Just the feeling of it. Warnings. Things you shouldn't do. A flash of something about sound. Something about stopping. If something sounded different, you had to stop. Wait. It felt like a long time ago, but the anxiety was fresh, like a bruise. 30 seconds, wasn't it? 30 seconds of stillness. That's what I thought I remembered. Honestly, it was probably just the acoustics. The freezer was cycling on and off. Maybe that was affecting the sound. Maybe the temperature change was doing something weird with the air. It sounded ridiculous even as I thought it, but I needed to rationalize, needed to pretend this wasn't happening, needed to just finish stocking the sugar and get back to the front. But the echo came again with my next shift of weight, confirming it wasn't my imagination. I forced myself to stand still. Right there, amidst the boxes of sugar and coffee filters, I counted the seconds in my head, trying to focus on anything but the increasing prickle on the back of my neck. 1, 2, 3. The echo continued with each breath, a ghostly mimicry of my own stillness. It wasn't fading. It wasn't lessening. The echo wasn't a response to my movement anymore. It was just present, a constant, unnerving resonance. 10, 11, 12. I needed to get to the phone to call Weston. Tell him something was wrong. I knew Ilse was out front, but Weston, at least, he might listen. He seemed more grounded, less likely to write me off as sleep-deprived and losing it. 15, 16, 17, but I couldn't move. Not yet. Not until 30 seconds. 29, 30. I took a tentative step. The echo persisted, even without me moving. It was louder, somehow, more insistent. I glanced towards the walk-in freezer. The metal door was slightly ajar, casting a pale blue light onto the concrete floor. I hadn't left it open. I specifically remembered closing it. I needed to check it, needed to make sure everything was okay, that the temperature hadn't spiked, that nothing had fallen inside. But the echo, it felt like a wall now, a barrier. I tried another step, then another, ignoring the rule, pushing through the unsettling resonance. The echo didn't diminish. It seemed to be emanating from the freezer, like something inside was responding. I had to know what was in there. I had to. My mind raced, recalling the drain inspection, the thing I'd pulled out, the way Ilse had looked at me. This was different, but the feeling was the same, a sense of dread, a feeling of inevitability. I reached for the handle of the walk-in, almost frantic now, and that's when I noticed the discrepancy on the order pad. Bia, I'd taken her order 15 minutes ago. Tea, black, simple. But the pad now showed tea, black, and toast. I hadn't taken a toast order from her. I distinctly remembered only the tea. I looked up. Bia was gone. The booth was empty. Her paperback lay open on the vinyl seat. But she wasn't there, and the air around her booth was noticeably colder than anywhere else in the diner. I stared at the empty booth, the forgotten toast order, the pervasive echo resonating from the walk-in freezer, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I hadn't checked on BA. I had prioritized the echo over a customer. And now she was gone. The chipped formica of the counter felt cool under my forearm as I wiped it down. 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Just the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional crackle of the highway patrol dispatch on the radio for company. I was going through the motions, really. Wiping, polishing, rearranging the sugar packets. Anything to avoid thinking about the bills, about Sarah, about the drawing I hadn't finished for Lily. It was a cartoon dragon, supposed to be breathing bubbles. Lily liked bubbles. I'd been at it for almost an hour, just cleaning. When I remembered the badges, the visitor badges, Weston had mentioned it when I'd clocked in. A quick reminder. End of shift, Kieran. Count them. Make sure they all came back in. Seemed simple enough. A security thing, probably. Truckers weren't exactly known for their discretion. The badge box was in the back office, in the bottom drawer of Weston's desk. It was a flimsy cardboard thing, the kind you get from an office supply store, filled with those plastic clip-on badges. Each one had a numbered slot, and a corresponding logbook where you were supposed to write down the name and time of entry. I pulled out the box, then the logbook. It was a spiral-bound notebook, mostly empty, with neat, precise handwriting. Weston's. There were 50 badges in the box. I started counting, carefully, methodically. 1, 2, 3, each one clicking softly as I placed it back in the box after verifying the number. It was a small, mindless task, a welcome distraction. 47, 48, 49, 50, all accounted for. Then I opened the logbook. Weston always kept it meticulously up to date. I flipped to the last entry. Jasper Bellwether, 9:17 p.m. Jasper, the guy who'd ordered the chicken fried steak and coffee. I remembered him. Quiet, kept to himself, big hands, calloused knuckles. He'd left about an hour ago, but the book showed only 49 signatures. It was probably just a mistake. Weston probably hadn't logged the return. He was always rushing, always stressed about something. He'd been looking particularly haggard lately, ever since his mother got sick. I closed the book, started to put it back in the drawer, then stopped. I double-checked the badges, counted them again, 50. I flipped back to the logbook, scanning the earlier entries. It was then I saw it. The date on the last entry before Jasper Bellwether, July 14th, 6 months ago, a name I didn't recognize. Ilse Kruger. The handwriting was identical to the Jasper Bellwether entry. But Ilse hadn't been through here in months. I'd remember Ilse, she was noticeable. I checked the badge box again, this time looking for a missing badge with the number corresponding to Ilse Kruger's entry. It wasn't there. Badge number 32 was gone. I felt a ridiculous urge to laugh, to just shake my head and walk away. A clerical error, that's all this was. A misplaced badge, a forgotten signature. Weston was overworked. I was tired, and my brain was running on fumes. But the logbook didn't lie, and the badge wasn't in the box. The rule, it came back in fragments, A half-remembered warning from the document I'd skimmed on my first day. Something about counting, about making sure everything came back, about what happened if it didn't. Don't leave, that was the part that stuck with me. Don't leave if the numbers don't match. It wasn't a clear instruction, more like a feeling, a dark weight settling in my chest. I glanced towards the front of the diner. Ilse was behind the counter, polishing the coffee urns with a methodical, unsettling calm. She hadn't said a word to me since I'd clocked in. She rarely did, but her eyes, they seemed to be fixed on me, even when she was looking past me. I tried to dismiss it. She was just being Ilse. Eccentric, quiet, a little creepy, that was all. But the logbook was open on the desk, the missing entry staring up at me, and the badge wasn't there. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum. I walked to the front, trying to appear casual, trying not to draw attention to myself. I needed to ask Ilse about the logbook, about July 14th, about badge number 32. "Ilse," I said, my voice sounding strangely thin in the quiet diner. She didn't respond, didn't even look up. I cleared my throat. "Ilse, do you remember signing in 6 months ago, July 14th? She slowly turned her head, her eyes meeting mine. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Then, a faint smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Kieran," she said, her voice a low, rasping whisper. "You're so concerned with the numbers." She gestured with the polishing cloth towards the back of the diner, towards the walk-in freezer. The place where Bia had disappeared. I didn't need to turn around to know that the metal door was slightly ajar, casting that same pale blue light onto the concrete floor. And I could have sworn, just for a moment, that I heard a faint echo coming from inside. Not of my footsteps, but of a voice, a woman's voice, saying a single word. 32. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air felt thick, oppressive. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant suddenly seemed overwhelming. I stared at Ilse, at her unsettling smile, at the open door of the freezer, and the weight in my chest grew heavier. The numbers hadn't just been a clerical error. Something else was happening, something I didn't understand, and I was trapped. The shift wasn't over, not by a long shot. The pay stub felt flimsy in my hand. The paper was thin and smelled faintly of chlorine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the copay for another round of physical therapy for Sarah. She was getting better, slowly, but the bills just kept coming. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my wallet with the other ones. They were all identical little squares of temporary relief. I clocked out at 6. Ilse barely glanced up as she punched the card. She was already wiping down the counter, moving with that same unnerving precision. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't even make eye contact. I just grabbed my jacket and walked out into the pre-dawn gray. The air smelled like diesel and rain. Driving home, I kept checking the rear-view mirror. Not for cars, but for something else. It wasn't a conscious thought, more like a twitch, a reflex. I'd started doing it on the way to work too. Every reflective surface, windows, chrome bumpers, even the black screen of my phone, just a quick, involuntary glance, scanning the space behind me for, I didn't know what. A distortion, maybe, a flicker, something that wasn't right. I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion, to the stress of everything. It was a truck stop, after all. Strange people passed through there all the time. I was probably just imagining things, just letting my nerves get the better of me. It was a weird job, sure, but it was a job. People get jumpy working late nights. But the checking persisted. And so did the counting. I found myself counting everything. Floor tiles at the gas station, telephone poles along the highway, the number of times my daughter's teacher emailed me about her reading log. It wasn't a deliberate act. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I caught myself mid-count, the numbers swirling in my head. It was like a compulsion, a need to impose order on something chaotic. Sarah was sleeping when I got home. Her face was pale against the pillow. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her for a long time, just breathing. It felt good to be home, safe, relatively normal. I still flinched whenever I heard an echo, though, even in the hallway of our small house, and I avoided looking up into attics, under bridges, into trees, anything that created a space above me. It wasn't a rational fear, it was just there, a tightening in my chest, a prickling on the back of my neck. I'd found myself taking the long way around things, adding unnecessary mileage to avoid passing under overpasses. I've been back at my old job at the warehouse for 2 weeks now. The pay is worse, but the predictability is a relief. No more late nights, no more ILSI, no more rules. I still get the static sometimes, a faint buzzing in my fingertips, particularly when I'm near electrical outlets. I've stopped trying to explain it away. Last week, I was driving past the diner on my way to pick up groceries. I didn't plan on stopping, but I found myself slowing down, pulling into the parking lot. A new ad was taped to the window. Help wanted overnight waitress. Apply within. The diner looked the same. The chipped formica tables, the faded red vinyl booths, the flickering neon sign. But something was different. The front window was meticulously clean, gleaming in the afternoon sun, and taped next to the help wanted sign was a small, hand-drawn picture, a yellow mug, perfectly rendered in crayon. Below it, in neat block letters, was a single word: 32.